So I'll start by defending not the liberal echo chamber, but the idea of, if you will, the liberal project, but also emphasizing what I think are the weaknesses of the liberal project and why I think it's failing. Because I'll agree with John in the sense that I think we are failing. There's no question that the world today, I'm not going to do a big survey, but the world today has rejected the idea certainly of economic liberalism, certainly the idea of economic freedom. Since the days of Reagan and Thatcher, we have been slowly moving away, both rhetorically, ideologically, and practically, away from the ideas of economic liberty. And with the Berlin Wall falling, and everybody convinced that now is going to be the heyday of liberalism, now is going to be the heyday of free markets. We had won, the Soviets had lost, communism had lost, socialism has lost. Here we are today with statism being the dominant ideology pretty much across the board, both in Europe. The UK just did this beautiful Brexit. Everybody was excited, they were thrilled. All my free market friends were like, yes, finally. And what have they done with Brexit? They've basically adopted all the regulatory regime of the EU. They've actually gone further left on environmentalism than even the EU expected. They have done all the bad things that we expected. So Nikos here, who lives in Greece, was telling me he was shipping things to the UK. Cost of shipping has doubled. The bureaucracy has increased in terms of trade. The bureaucracy has increased in terms of immigration, obviously. You can't get into the UK. There's a shortage. If you go to a hotel in London, there's a shortage of employees in London because they can't get the Eastern Europeans who used to come, visa-free to come and work in the UK. And what they've done with the freedom that they got from the EU is become more statist, not become freer. I remember commenting on Brexit at the time. I said, whether Brexit is good or bad depends on what you make of it. And so far, it has not been good. But of course, the EU is a disaster as well. So it's not like the alternative is a good alternative. In the United States, we've gone through 2 decades of increasing government spending, increasing government involvement, increasing government regulations, increasing government controls. It doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat. And the voice that some of us had in the past, the liberal voice, the pro-free market voice, is being diminished. I'm happy for John as a regular at Fox, but I used to be quite regular at Fox, never quite as regular as John is, but they won't have me on anymore. They're not interested in my voice on Fox. It's just no interest. And it's not like somebody else replaced me, like the competition replaced me. I wish, right? Somebody younger, more dynamic than me had replaced me. No, it is a fact that there's just no interest in a kind of a capitalist free market voice in the mainstream media in the United States today, or in alternative media, which tends to be more populist and more nationalistic than the mainstream media is. So the liberal project is failing. There's no question about that. Liberal as meaning kind of the free market ideas, and social freedoms as well as economic freedoms. And I think at the end of the day, the question is why. You could argue that part of it is that we'd be talking to one another, the echo chamber. And that is an issue, right? You go to places like Freedom Fest and other places, and we're very good at talking to one another, and very few of us go out there and engage with the world. But the Roadshow, John does a lot of talks to all kinds of groups. I do a ton of talks. I don't know that it's that. I think the liberal project is failing because I'll use Ayn Rand's critique here. It really is that the liberal project has never adopted a philosophical context. It's never properly defended the philosophical foundation of free markets. We've counted in great economists. We've had great economists, Hayek and Friedman and Mises and so on. We've had fantastic economists. We still have great economists at every university in the United States. There's a good free market economist. And we talk and we explain why minimum wage is bad, and we explain why trade is good, and we explain all these things, and nobody cares. Because nobody really cares about economics. Nobody's motivated by economics. Nobody's driven by economics. People want to do what they think is right and just. They want to do what they believe is acceptable culturally. They want to do what they envision is the good. The battle over liberty has always been a philosophical battle, a moral battle, more than it's been an economic battle. And all of our conversations, all of our efforts, all of our emphasis has been in economics. And I think we fail when we do economics. And the philosophers we've had, and I know I'm at the Hayek Center, so I have to be careful, but they're very tolerant. The philosophers we've had, like Hayek, have been conventional when it comes to philosophical. Hayek is a great economist. He's a genius economist. He's conventional philosophically. He's a conventional social thinker. He's not an original social thinker. He's not going to differentiate. He's not ultimately the kind of defender of individualism that we need. Ayn Rand had a copy of The Road to Serfdom where she did marginal comments on it. And it's quite entertaining to read her commentary on it because he compromises throughout with statism and with collectivism and with conservatism. He even had to write an essay why I'm not a conservative because he sounded so much like a conservative so often. So I think what's lacking is a true moral defense of individualism, and only by defending individualism will we be able to defend capitalism and the market economy in a true laissez-faire capitalist economy. Liberalism is faltered because it has refused to be radical philosophically. It's tried to create too big of a tent. It's tried to embrace all philosophers. It's tried to embrace too many people who completely disagree on fundamentals, and therefore it has squandered the genius of its economists because it has not developed a moral theory that rises to the occasion. And here I think, and I've said this here, and I've said this at other events. Here I think the great libertarian, liberal thinkers of the past, the economists did themselves a great disservice by not taking Rand more seriously. I think if they'd engaged with their ideas, I'm not saying they had to agree with their ideas, but if they'd engaged with those ideas, engaged with the need for a reconceptualization of individualism and a moral code, I think we would be in a different world today. But sadly, with the exception of Mises, they basically ignored her. And I think by doing so, they did a massive disservice to the cause of liberalism. And the fact is, as a result of that, I think today we are losing. All yours, John.
Well, I feel like I'm in the position that the great Edward Gibbon was when he sat down to write The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is a pretty doleful book, full of the sad decline of a great society. On the other hand, he did say there is much ruin in an empire. It takes a long time.
Yeah.
And at any given point, there are paths you can take which can restore your greatness. I'm not going to disagree with what Yaron said, but I do want to flesh it out a bit. The liberal project that we thought we had initiated after the fall of communism in 1989 turns out not to have been the liberal project we thought it was. At that point, there was an understanding that with the fall of communism, markets would dominate the world. We'd have both freedom on the factory floor and freedom in politics. And a scholar named Francis Fukuyama even wrote The End of History, saying that liberal democracy had triumphed and there was nothing left to write about. He's still scribbling to this day, trying to explain that. Why did we fail? And here I want to speak in terms that are a little below the level of the PhD student, a little below that of a sophisticated elite audience. It's at the level of the common man and woman. And I think if we've learned anything in the last quarter century, It is that elites both on the left and the right tended to forget the interests of and ignore the views of and fail to respect the opinions of the broad mass of people. We know the communists ignored the people because they oppressed them. But people who claim to be the barriers of the liberal torch tended to ignore, dismiss, or disparage the interests of the common person. And a perfect example of that is how we handled the nation state. The communists tried to obliterate the nation state, and they tried to obliterate it by claiming that it had been transcended by the new socialist man. They tended, as the Soviet Union explained, the Soviet Union was a group of people from all over the spectrum of ethnic backgrounds and perspectives, all in fraternal socialist brotherhood. So after communists fell, the traditional notion of the nation state was also still in disarray and in disrepute. So we had the rise of what I would call the new cosmopolitans. And the British writer David Goodhart says that throughout Western democracies, there developed a split, a division between what he called the anywheres and the nowheres. And the anywheres were the cosmopolitans who, by virtue of their income or their education or their background, considered themselves sophisticated. And they believed in multilateral institutions like the United Nations. They believed that the nation state should be subordinated because of its nationalism was the cause of World War II, should be subordinated to larger and larger bureaucracies that would manage the affairs of nations so that they would never come into conflict. And I'm talking about what ultimately became the European Union and the American superstate based in Washington inside the Beltway. And as a result, there became a complete disconnect between the interests of people who remained rooted to their neighborhood, their community, their faith in some cases, the original job that their fathers and grandfathers did, and the sophisticated elites, the anywheres, who basically felt that everything could be portable, including in some cases national loyalties. So what we have now is a situation in which we've made fundamental mistakes. Yaron and I agree, of course, that there should be free trade. It turns out that what we got was a form of managed trade. Probably the biggest mistake that historians will think about this era is that somehow the Western nations were compelled to believe that if they let the Chinese into the World Trade Organization in 2001, even though they didn't meet the criteria, which they didn't, that would help democratize China, and it would civilize the Chinese, and they would develop capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Instead, they developed totalitarianism with Chinese characteristics. And then, of course, we had 2008, the Great Recession. And there's one thing that all of our Western democracies have in common with that recession. All of our central banks decided to bail out the people who were responsible for it and subsidize them. And the people who were just earning wage income stagnated or lost their jobs or had to retrain. If there's one bet you had to make the last 13 years or so since the Great Recession, it would be that if you invested in stocks, you've done very well. And if you invested in trying to earn a living with your hands or with your brain power at a traditional salary job, you have fallen further and further behind. And that has created the great upheaval that we've seen, the populist upheaval, which has occurred in every European country to one degree or another, and of course has occurred in the United States. I just have to mention the name Donald Trump and you will understand where I'm coming from. So the challenge that we have in restoring liberalism to a degree of respect is first, and here I agree very strongly with Yaron, we have to have a better definition, we have to defend it more strenuously. We have to have fewer compromises. But at the same time that we do that, we have to find new audiences. We have to talk to people we're not normally used to talking to or with. We have to begin where they are rather than where we want them to be. And we have to understand their frame of reference and discuss it as it involves and influences their daily lives, rather than in some theoretical or abstract way. And a perfect example of that is the importance. I give you an example of the rule of law. The rule of law tells us that everyone should be treated as far as possible equally before the law. Well, we're seeing a fraying of that. I know in Austria, one of the most frustrating things I think my Austrian friends have seen over the last 20 years is how political scandals are treated in, shall we say, very unequal ways. If they come from a certain part of the purport system, they're treated one way, and if they come from another part of the purport system, they're treated another way. And this kind of, the way that scandals, whether they involve a ship blowing up in the Indian Ocean in the 90s, which set a terrible precedent, I think we all know that scandal, or whether they involve the recent scandal that brought down Chancellor Kurz. There's a lot of cynicism in our societies about the rule of law. One of the things I think Ayn Rand, when she spoke in practical political terms, did was she spoke very much about the importance of the rule of law. In addition to the philosophical underpinnings of a society must operate as far as possible with the rule of law. I think that a lot of the common person has now become very cynical and very skeptical that the rule of law is at work in many Western democracies. So I think we have to work on that. I also think we have to work on the fact that the left has consciously chosen to not teach our history, our values, our traditions in the public schools of whatever country we're talking about. They have a new history to teach. It's called woke history. And it begins with oppression and colonialism, even if you didn't have any colonies. I'm astonished to meet Austrian school children who are filled with stories about the horror stories of what went on in the Austrian colonies. And except for one small corner of China, which I think was 45 acres, there were no Austrian colonies. But they are convinced that there were. So that just gives you an example of how bad things have gotten. I'll close with this. Ronald Reagan, whom I was privileged to know and learned a great deal from, gave a farewell address in 1989. It was a very optimistic address, befitting the Gipper. He spoke about progress that he felt had been made towards that shining city on a hill that he often spoke about. But he did issue one warning, and that warning was, he said that liberty and the love of freedom cannot be transmitted through the bloodstream. It cannot be passed on from one generation to another as a mere inheritance or a legacy. It has to be communicated and passed on with the active support and the active participation of parents and teachers and leaders and community figures, so that people understand where the country began, what made its traditions important, why they still are important today. And in the case of the United States, it's our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, which all students of liberty, even though they recognize the shortcomings of those documents, do rally around. Those are the glue that often unites all strands of the liberty movement. And if you don't do that, if you deracinate the curriculum, if you don't teach the history of the country, or you disparage it, eventually you're going to hollow out the nation. The nation state, of course, itself will be meaningless, because what created the nation state? What brought it together and what has kept it together? If you don't teach that to the children, you have nothing, except what they replace it with, which is the philosophies of grievance, victimization, wokeism, political correctness, and all that we have heard. So I am very much concerned about the course of the last 25 years, but I also believe this, and this is about to happen in the United States, and as you know, we are sometimes the leading instigator in this. Ronald Reagan did say one other thing. After every great defeat, he said, well, you know, we lose when the other side does two things. One, they pretend that they're moderates and not on the left, and we make mistakes. We fail to communicate, or we compromise, or we don't articulate our vision properly. And that's when we lose. But he said, when they take power, in the political sense, something happens. First of all, no matter how they might claim to be governing as moderates, they will govern from the left. Their interest groups, the people behind them, their own ideology and their own sense of purpose mean they will govern from the left. And he said, I can tell you what will happen. They will fail. They will always fail. And when they fail, people will notice. And if they fail enough, eventually people will notice enough that they will be open to hearing your ideas, your philosophy, your alternative way of thinking, and you will have another chance to make your case to the people, both philosophically and at the ballot box. And that's about to happen in the United States. Donald Trump, for a variety of reasons, namely related to his personality, did lose the election, despite the ambiguities that I discuss in my book. He did lose the election to a figure who campaigned as a moderate, Joe Biden, a safe pair of hands, someone who'd been a boring United States senator for 46 years and then a vice president. And what did Biden do? He promised to govern from the middle, and he governed from the left, far more than even I thought possible. And has he failed? Mm-hmm. Spectacularly so. Beyond anyone's conception or imagination, he has failed. Do you realize that when Biden took office, gasoline was €2 a gallon? €2 a gallon. And now it's 3.5? It's astonishing. Just astonishing. And we haven't even gotten to Afghanistan or Ukraine or inflation. By the way, the new numbers came out this morning. We can be very proud to be first again. We now, for the first time since 1979, have 10% inflation in the United States. What an accomplishment. Huh?
Officially.
Officially.
Yeah.
And of course, yes, and we all know it's a weighted basket of goods. So the left, look, as much as we can be depressed and as much as we can find cause for tempered view of the future, we can be assured of one thing. The reason why we are not them is we know they fail. That their instincts are against that, despite their claims by their Marxist cousins, against that of human nature. They will fail, and they have failed, and they will continue to fail. So long as that is the case, and so long as we do not slip into complete authoritarianism or totalitarianism, we will have a chance to fight back, and we will have a chance to win. We will have a chance to make the argument on the playing field of ideas again. So that's what I live for, and if I didn't believe that, and if I hadn't seen it happen over and over again, I would have retired a long time ago. I'm still in the fight, and I still plan to be for a long time to come. Thank you.
So we're going, okay.
Would you like to add up on that and
Sure.
comment, and then I think we're open to the floor for questions and discussion.
Yeah, so obviously, I agree with a lot of what John just said. I mean, he was describing the world to a large extent as it is. I'm a little bit more, I guess, pessimistic because I worry about, for two reasons. One is, it's true, the left always fails. It has to. It's anti-human nature and it has to fail. The problem is we never learn the lessons from that, so that what happens over the last 100 years is that the center has moved left. That is, as the left fails, the next iteration doesn't go all the way towards freedom, it moves somewhere closer to where the left started, and then we go even further left, we fail, and then, the pendulum goes back and forth, but the pendulum is always tilted, thank you. The pendulum is always tilted towards the left, and the center today is where the left was in the past. So I worry about where we're heading. I also worry that the alternative today, in America at least, the place that I know, but I think it's true in Europe as well, is not so much that there's socialism or liberalism as the two alternatives, but there is a statist right today that is growing in influence, that has, I think, a significant voice, that is quite intellectual, that is gaining ground among young people. I see it on campuses. I see it everywhere, and it is as illiberal, right? I subscribe now to a Substack called the Liberal Right, right? Patrick Deneen's new Substack, and there is a growing force of illiberalism on the right. And it seems to me that the liberal element, the pro-free markets, the pro-freedom element, the individualistic element, is actually now being attacked on both flanks. In a sense, we always were, but now I think it's much more explicit and much more vibrant. You're seeing it in places like Poland and Hungary, where you're seeing this nationalist right, this anti-liberal right attack, and you're seeing that adoration that somebody like Orban gets by many on the right in the United States. So there's a socialism on the left and a socialism on the right, and we're seeing both of them manifest in American politics for the first time in ways that I did not expect, and ways that I think are quite scary. And I think Donald Trump, to a large extent, I think the real damage Donald Trump did was to bring out that element and to legitimize it, and to introduce it to its audience. And the audience is many of the people that John described. The audience is people who feel aggrieved, people who hate the left for cultural reasons, not for economic reasons. They agree with the left on most economic reasons, but they hate the left for cultural reasons, and now we've got a right that is adopting the left's economic agenda and rejecting the cultural agenda, and that's perfect for this audience. So that leads me to, so I tend to be more pessimistic about where we are today in terms of the pendulum, because I see the dangers on the right as well as on the left. I also worry about kind of the history as John described it, because I don't think it's quite right. And I think it leads, it plays into the hands of our enemies. So I think what's happened is that the welfare states, and again I'll talk about the United States because that's what I know, that the welfare state in the United States changed the people. It changed people's attitudes towards life and towards culture, and that our politicians and our intellectuals played into that. So America used to be a place where people followed the opportunities. People did not sit around waiting for jobs. There was massive mobility in America. People moved from state to state. Of course, America is the land of immigrants. People came to America. So mobility was part of the culture in America, and you went to where the jobs were, and you didn't believe in stagnation. You believed in growth and development and enterprise, and we saw that. We saw that even through the 80s. We still saw that kind of mobility. But as the welfare state solidified itself and grew, and as politicians both on left and right justified the welfare state, expanded the welfare state, grew the welfare state, people started lose that element the conservatives always talked about, of personal responsibility. They stopped looking for the best job. They accepted stagnation. They were willing to sit in their homes in Ohio and wait for the jobs to come back. And they got welfare checks in the meantime, so it wasn't that bad. But it created resentment. Why are those guys in Silicon Valley doing so well, and I'm sitting here and I used to have a great steel job? And you know what? The steel jobs are never coming back because they never went away. They were taken over by robots, not by the Chinese. 90-something% of the jobs lost in America, lost in America, were lost to technology, not to China. But it used to, but there are plenty of jobs in the U.S. Right now, there's 10 million jobs that go unfilled, and there've always been jobs. And you travel in certain parts of America, and you see massive industry and growth, and like I always use the example of Northwest Arkansas. Right? Nobody would have thought of Northwest Arkansas. It's where Walmart is. But because Walmart is there, a huge number of industries have grown around Northwest Arkansas. Northwest Arkansas is booming. In the old days, and I don't know how far back you have to go, somebody in Ohio who lost a job would get in their car and move to Northwest Arkansas, get a job. No more. Now they sit in Ohio and they bitch and complain, and they adopt ideologies that are anti-globalization, anti-immigrants, anti-everything, because they feel that they have been, that things have gone against them. So I think the mentality of the American people has changed. And I think the mentality of the American people has changed. It's our fault, right? I mean, intellectuals more broadly, have fed into that and have told them it's okay for them to change. It's okay for them to sit in Ohio and wait for the jobs to show up. It's okay, and here's a check. Don't worry, be happy. Here's a check. There are consequences to welfare state. And the welfare state is horrific psychologically to the people who receive welfare. The reason the welfare state is immoral is not so much because it steals my money and gives it to somebody else. It's not me that it's harming. I can afford it, in a sense. The real danger of a welfare state is what it does to the recipient, the mentality. And 49% of Americans receive some form of compensation from the government in some ways, and in Europe it's even greater. That changes the way people think, and it changed the culture in America in negative ways. That spirit of don't tread on me, that spirit of I can succeed, that entrepreneurial spirit in vast parts of the country disappeared.
You know, Yaron, I have to just interpose myself here for a second. I think Yaron is perfectly describing a significant but minority part of our population, even with all the changes that he correctly identifies. And I say that for the following reason. The phenomenon he describes is true. There are people who sit in Ohio and Pennsylvania and will never move, and they're stagnant. They've been around for a long time, steal jobs or no. One of the most important psychological things you can tell about people is they say in theory they want change, and in practice they don't want any part of it. People are inherently hidebound. But there's a reason why the top 10 states in our country, the United States, with the lowest unemployment, all have Republican governors. There's a reason why the states without an income tax, which are 9 of the 50, are the ones that are fastest growing. There's a reason why the place where I live, that New York, is hollowing out and people are moving out. COVID had several interesting effects. Many of them were bad, of course, but they also were some things that we should understand. It did get people moving. If you know anyone in New York City, I think the chance is that they've moved to Florida now. 12 million Americans now teach their children at home, homeschooling. They no longer have confidence in the public schools because they don't even know if they're going to be open. Mm-hmm. The teachers' union has gone from the protector of the teachers to the tormentor of my children. They're the only people left who still want their children to wear masks. The children don't want to wear masks at school. So there are countervailing trends here. And the question is, who's going to win? And I say it's in the balance. Of course the welfare state has eroded personal responsibility. But I would remind you that as the longer that COVID went on, the less support there was for the kind of broad handouts and public support that were offered. A year ago, no one, and I mean no one, thought that Joe Biden's Build Back Better program wouldn't pass in some form. No one. You know how much has passed? Zero. Why? I think we have to ask that question before we give up on the United States or we give up on other Western democracies. And I will say, I even see sprouts of the spring in Europe, where people finally woke up and they decided they didn't want COVID forever, or at least the mental cloud cover that COVID represented, where it not only affected our health, but it affected our mental health and our attitudes about the future and what our children and grandchildren could expect. So I say the debate is on, and COVID has clarified it rather than suppressed it. And I think we all have to be part of that debate, and if we lose, we lose, but I think we have a chance to win.
Well, at least the two of you and many people here in this room have been fighting for that for many decades.
So let me just say, I mean, I think COVID's interesting because I take the exact opposite view with regard to COVID. COVID was super depressing in this sense. Never in my life did I imagine that state after state after state in the United States could shut down, literally lock people up, and pass and people would abide by it. I believed it in Europe. I believed you guys would stay home. But Americans, I mean, I moved to America, right? And Israelis, I came from Israel. Never did I think that the Israeli state could lock people at home and that people would say, yes, sir, we're going to stay home. And yes, some people objected and some people rebelled, and yes, red states opened up earlier. But even red states, even in Texas, for months, people didn't open their businesses, weren't allowed. I mean, at some point in Orange County where I lived, again, a more conservative part of the country, restaurants were opening in spite of the fact that they weren't allowed to open, and they were saying, come and arrest us. But that took a while. You'd think that would have happened in America right off the bat. So what scares me, and I want to be as optimistic as John, and there are days when I am, but the amount of conformity, the amount of acceptance of authority that I saw in COVID, I never thought I would see in the United States of America. And I don't believe 20 years earlier would have happened. I don't believe you could have gotten away with it. And indeed, if you look at the CDC documents, the CDC plan for what would happen in a pandemic, they ruled out lockdowns. Lockdowns were never considered. And big reason for that is in America, nobody would abide by them. And yet, it turns out we did. So that, yes, in the last few months, in the last year maybe, there's been some opposition, and there's always opposition to the left when they get completely kooky, and everybody realizes, yes, we don't want to be that kooky. But the question is, even inflation, it's wonderful to blame Joe Biden for the inflation, and I'm happy to join the bandwagon of blaming Joe Biden for the inflation. But the fact is that Trump printed pretty much as many dollars as Joe Biden did during COVID, the same kind of bailout. But I did want to make a point about 2008, because I think 2008 is a key moment. It's a key event. It's an event, I think, not only in the West, but I think throughout the world. We did, and here I include all of us, I think, we did a lousy job in 2008 of explaining to the world what happened. And I think the unanimous consensus was that capitalism had failed.
Sure.
And I think China pivoted after 2008. They said, we don't want that. I mean, I'm not sure they ever wanted it, but Xi comes afterwards, and Xi doesn't want to have anything to do with Western style capitalism and goes completely authoritarian. But even in America, we did a lousy job explaining to the world what actually happened. And I think part of the problem is this idea that it's the bankers who, yes, no bank should have been bailed out, but who's at fault? Who caused 2008? But I'd say Dodd-Frank caused it as much as anybody. It's the people who got the bill named after them, supposedly solving it. It's the entire mixed economy, the entire regulatory state, the entire structure. And we did not explain to the world that the solution is not more of the same. The solution is to unwind all the disastrous regulations that caused 2008, that caused the crisis, that was what was necessary. And this goes back to Fukuyama. The problem with Fukuyama is he thought the end of history was, yes, the end of ideology. He thought that the end of history was this mixed economy, gray, a mishmash of socialism, this liberal democracy idea that, whatever, as long as we don't have socialism and as long as we don't have fascism, something in between. But there was no, what is it? What are we actually fighting for? Europe, what we had in Europe. Well, what we had in Europe is unstable. Mixed economies are unstable. Mixed economies will either become more free or less free. And without clear advocacy for more free, they will become less free. And what's happened is they've all become less free.
Maybe we should go to the audience.
Yes.
Yes. Martin, Nikos.
Well, first of all, thanks for talking. I enjoyed it immensely. sure if I agree that we didn't learn any lessons and also that liberalism has failed. I agree on the aspect that political liberalism has failed, but I think there's also an anti-political liberalism, and one aspect of that we already heard of, that's for example homeschooling. In other important examples, the most known are Airbnb, Uber, Bitcoin. That's typical examples of that. And also, I think the technology tends to reduce the cost of defending for the individual against the state immensely. And therefore, I think the lesson that we learned maybe could be as liberals, as libertarians, that we are likely to win in the political sphere, but we should try to change the system or the society outside of the political system. And I wanted to ask, what's your opinion on that?
So let me disagree a little bit. So wonderful things happened. Uber, Airbnb, Bitcoin, wonderful things. None of them had anything to do with liberalism. They had amazing entrepreneurs who had a vision and executed onto it. But the fact is, and you're seeing it, is that the state is co-opting all of those. They're certainly co-opting Uber and Airbnb. Uber and Airbnb are now regulated in ways that I think the founder of Uber would be horrified by. Airbnb is now paying the same kind of taxes and the same kind of abiding by regulations because the hotels lobbied and they achieved, they succeeded politically. You can't escape politics. And Bitcoin, a lot of big advocates of Bitcoin are now talking to governments about how, particularly now with Russia, about how we can get more transparency and how we can make this more part of the status system. And so I don't think you can escape politics. Technology is wonderful, and technology is the one area that I agree with you, I'm optimistic about, if it's left free. But let me give you and homeschooling is fantastic, and I agree with John completely. The best thing coming out of COVID is homeschooling. It's amazing. And the distrust generally of the teachers union and government schools. But I'll give you where I think we're losing. So, and I hate to be the pessimist on the panel, right? But so be it. So there was a student group, a very active student group before Trump got elected, called Turning Point. John, I'm sure, is familiar with Turning Point and Charlie Cook. And before Trump was elected, Turning Point USA was growing, and they fantastic, and they were liberal. Charlie Cook was, I knew him quite well, and he pro-capitalist, and he gave a great speech, and he was fantastic. And over the last 6 years, really, they have converted from being a liberal, right liberal kind of a position. These young people, 18, 20, 22, it was fantastic to watch. They've become this populist, nationalist, statist kind of youth movement. And they're as big, if not bigger, than they were when they were liberal. And so it's not just in politics. It's affecting young people. And when I go to campuses, I'm seeing more and more of these kind of, I'm seeing conservatives become much more nationalist conservatives than the kind of free market conservatives of the old Wall Street Journal that John was a major part of. And they don't care about the economics of it. They don't care about liberty anymore, in a sense. What they care about are these things that I think go against liberty and go against the nationalism. But let's hope that the technologists figure out ways for us to keep growing and keep getting around all the constraints that happen.
John?
Well, I met some of those same young people, and maybe I went to different campuses, but I think that personality cults are personality cults, and you can have them on the left and you can have them on the right. I've known Donald Trump personally for 33 years. You can't be a journalist in Washington or New York and have him not try to sell you his story, and which he did many, many times. And of course I got Trump wrong. I didn't think he would become president. But I've learned. And I don't think there is a Trump successor out there. I really don't. And
you could return again, being president?
I'll bet a large sum of money to anyone in this room who wants to have their money taken from them. Bet a large sum of money.
That he won't run? Or that
No, that he will
win?
not become president again.
Okay.
I'll bet a large sum of money.
I hope you
And
win.
remember, I know stuff you don't.
Yes.
But I'll take your money anyway. And
Instead
whoever
of-
the Republican candidate is, let's say it's Ron DeSantis from Florida. Ron DeSantis is a Reaganite dressed up in Trump clothing for purposes of convenience. I don't think we have to, look, I think Ron DeSantis is the model. You recognize that Republicans were often criticized because they didn't want to fight. They didn't want to argue against the media. They were timid, and they didn't assert their philosophical underpinnings in bold, simple, clear language. And Donald Trump succeeded in large part because of those failures. I think the Republican Party has been changed by Trump. How much of it has been changed in a way that steers towards nationalism and against globalization and against these things is in dispute. The same people who want America first will revolt if Walmart raises its prices 25%, guaranteed. So a lot of this is attitudinal, it's not operational. Attitudinal, not operational. So I could be wrong, but I'm willing to take anyone's money who thinks Donald Trump is the future of the Republican Party.
Thank you.
This whole thing was worth just for me to hear that, because I believe John has inside information, so he knows what he's talking about.
I feel better too.
I feel much better now than I did coming in.
I'm wrong in many small things, usually not on big things.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you. The question is, so the left does rally its troops, they have envy, they have tribalism, they have this hate.
And now they have billionaires.
Yeah.
They didn't used to have billionaires.
They do, but the question is, how can the other side inspire passions except if by engaging in the culture war? So the problem is that the only thing that seems to be alive and sparking in the right, as you said, is things like Turning Point, but the more the right goes into the culture war, so things like the vaccines, the more depressive it becomes, the more intellectually shallow it becomes. So the question is there a way that the right can become something that is going to rally troops, is going to inspire people to go out and fight the war of ideas, which does not include all the culture wars?
Oh, we have opened a can of worms, haven't we? I'm from San Francisco. I grew up in the most moral latitudinarian place on the planet, I'm convinced. I'm the last person who you would think would support the culture wars. But they're not culture wars. They're wars against common sense and against crazy people. I have to tell you, what is the culture war? Vaccines? Should people, given that this is a brand new technology, and given the fact that the government lied to us through Dr. Fauci many, many times, should people automatically be compelled to take a vaccine without asking questions about it? I will tell you, I have 4 close friends who either themselves or through relatives took the vaccine. Now, I'm pro-vaccine. I can show you my vaccine card. But it is not without risk to some parts of the population. How many of you know Richard Epstein? Okay, he's one of the best philosophers in America. His wife got the Moderna vaccine, and the next day she fell on the street, completely fainted, broke several teeth, disfigured her face, went into the hospital. He teaches at New York University, he has access to the finest doctors in the world. And they established that it was vaccine related, her collapse. And Epstein said to the doctor, well, will you note that on her medical record? And he said, absolutely not. Under no circumstances am I going to put down that it was vaccine related because of the, shall we say, the culture smog. The only time I've ever been really sick in my life was when I got a botched vaccine. So there are risks and benefits here. I mean, I know it wasn't enforced dramatically in Austria, but even we were shocked that you walled in the unvaccinated and wouldn't let them go outside unless they were grocery shopping. We thought that was a fundamental infringement of civil rights. Now, is that the culture war, or is that a war about freedom? I think it's a war about freedom. Is it, if you pay taxes to send your children to public schools, and you don't have the money to go to private school, send them to private school, and the government wants to teach transgender theory to your 6-year-old, is that a culture war, or is that imposing the will of the state on the parent and a fundamental violation of their freedom? I don't think a child should be learning about sex at age 6 of any kind, gay, straight, or whatever. I just don't think a child should be learning about that, especially in the public school where the parent can't monitor the curriculum. So what you call the culture war, yes, there are people who can go overboard on it, and there are people who are religious fundamentalists, and I deplore their attitudes and their extremism. But in reality, the culture war is also a freedom war. And because it involves something that is really close to people, people's family and their private personal health is really important to them, even more so than money, even more so than the price of their stock, the value of their stock portfolio. So that's why there's passions about it, because there are people who, it's about something they really care about, their children, their neighborhood, whether 1 million immigrants go into Germany without any papers. Yes, that's a culture war, but it's also a war about the state ignoring the will of the people and trampling on basic freedoms of the people who already live there. So I'm not a cultural warrior by nature, but I am by choice, because ultimately this is about something being imposed upon people against their will.
But so I agree with that. I think the challenge is, and I don't think it's done, is to show how these issues are related to liberty and freedom. That is, they're dealt with in way too narrow a field, and unfortunately, they're often led by kooks, by the people who don't understand that this really is an issue of freedom. And we as intellectuals, and again, I think we as intellectuals are the ones who fail. It's not, the common people rely on us to do the work to try to explain the complexity of the world for them. We don't do a good enough job explaining how these issues are related to freedom and liberty. And at the end of the day, I'm a radical here, but I don't think you can have government schools and not have culture wars. Because what do you teach? You teach evolution or creationism? Well, it depends who the parents are. The parents have every right to have their kids learn creationism or learn CRT or non-CRT or whatever. And
knowing their children will rebel against it at some point.
Yes, exactly. and the only way to allow for the parents to have that kind of choice is to privatize the system. And what we need to rally around is not laws that prohibit CRT. What we need to rally around is laws that do things like education saving accounts and tax credits and things like that slowly diminish the role of government schools and elevate private education, because that's the only solution long term. And it's why homeschooling has become so popular, because people are realizing that. But homeschooling's hard.
Oh yeah,
it's hard.
Well, that's why they have these homeschool
Pods.
modules.
Yes, they have pods.
Your question was very important for one of the reasons. I want to get to other people too, but I really want to. You've honed in on something that's very, very important. I believe that the left. Yaron mentioned that a mixed economy is unstable, just like a central bank is unstable. So too is the left, the intellectual left. I have watched the intellectual left since I grew up in San Francisco. And I admit to being somewhat surprised that things I never thought possible are now, as Yaron says, in their center. But they have gone so far that it's like a planetary body that's unstable, and it's going to explode. And I'll give you just 2 observations. Their leading journal of intellectual opinion is the Jacobin. I don't have to tell you what happened to the Jacobins. I don't have to tell you what they eventually did to each other. You're all intelligent people. They're already eating into their own. Secondly, critical race theory, which is an umbrella term, and it can be almost anything, but critical race theory is unstable. You cannot have an intellectual theory which pits people against each other in purely racial terms in a society that frankly is less race conscious on a personal day-to-day level than ever. And you cannot sustain that level of anger and that level of unfairness. You cannot do it. Which is why I think the George Floyd movement after his death, his murder, was actually one of the worst things that could have happened to them. Because they took everything off the shelf and threw it into the streets and into the public discourse in the media before it was ready, before it had, shall we say, been road tested. Defund the police will go down in history as one of the worst tactical mistakes you can possibly make. It's like saying to people, go commit suicide, it's fun. I mean, it's not sustainable. And they themselves facing what will be one of the great election wipeouts of American history. Now, I realize this is political, not philosophical. I recognize the difference between philosophical victories and political victories. I'm not trying to put all my chips into politics. But in November, they are going to have an internal conversation. Like, it didn't work. And they're going to have a fight between the people who say we didn't go far enough and the people who said, well, let's not go far enough that we're going over the cliff. And listen, if for no other reason, Yaron could be right today, I could be right today, but it's going to be really entertaining.
Yes.
Well, the
November will be,
consequences of those politics we all suffer.
Yes,
November will be fun.
but I'm going to be more entertained after November than I am now.
Yeah, you both sounded to me slightly pessimistic, slightly in quotation mark. You have said liberalism has failed, the Liberal Party has failed. You have said failed.
No, I was speaking about cosmopolitan liberalism.
It remembers me a bit of Schumpeter's book.
I know. Yes.
Capitalism, Socialism.
Yes, carries the seeds
Who
of
at
it.
the time has already said capitalism comes to an end. Yeah? You know that? Or
Yes,
not?
I know it well.
Yeah. So what I would like to know is your attitude now in more or less like-minded circle a general American attitude, this pessimism, or are there still some people who sound slightly more optimistic?
You know, the great thing about the United States of America is we have 330 million people. You can find anything you want in 330
I
million
have
people.
said like-minded intellectuals. Whether you find there more, or I said, are there more or less like-minded intellectuals? I have not said 330 million Americans. I've said more or less like-minded intellectuals who sound a bit or even a
I don't
bit
think you can
more-
generalize.
more
I
think-
don't think you can generalize.
Pardon?
I don't think you can generalize.
I think you'll find everything among intellectuals, a variety of different points of view. The people who are more pessimistic than we are,
Can you name 2 or 3 who are really
Optimistic.
optimistic and say, okay, this actually is a difficult time, as we all know. We have the pandemic, we have...
Tyler Cowen is optimistic. Richard Epstein is
Pardon?
Tyler Cowen of Marginal Revolutions is optimistic. Richard
He is.
Epstein is optimistic. I think if you polled the Nobel Prize winners like Vernon Smith, you'd find more optimism than pessimism.
Okay, I'm satisfied.
Ned Phelps.
Yes,
Ned
yes.
Phelps is
Who?
also, Ned Phelps, the
Phelps?
Nobel, Phelps, the Nobel
Phelps.
laureate.
Phelps.
Look, let me say something about the intellectual forces on the left. I think they have a problem that I just never thought I'd see. The old style hardcore leftists are now scared of the youngsters, turning them in to the faculty tribunals and the show trials. And the youngsters and the communists are all worried about, remember the famous audience that Stalin had when he gave one of his speeches for 5 hours, and they all stood up and clapped, and they clapped for 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and finally one guy decided it was safe to sit down, and he was never seen again.
Yep.
They're in that position. I mean, I have to tell you, I have left-wing professor friends who are way, way to the left of the conventional liberal. And they live in quiet terror that they're going to be supplanted by yet more people who are crazier than they are.
Yeah.
This is not an intellectually healthy movement. It's a stagnant movement. It is extremely strong because it is ruthless and because, frankly, they've taken advantage of what Yaron's identified, the flabbiness of our philosophical defense and discourse. I admit that. They've taken advantage of our flabbiness, but they've created a system which carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. There is not a coherent leftist intellectual argument out there. There's a coherent argument to seize power. Yes, to seize power and be authoritarian and tamp down all criticism so you don't have to have a discussion on philosophical grounds. Because if you seize the levers of power and you fire and jail people who disagree with you, that's a solution. You don't have to have an intellectual debate. But so long as there's enough freedom to have an intellectual debate, I don't think they can sustain what they have. I really don't. I mean, Yaron meets these people. I don't think they can sustain their movement unless they seize power in a very authoritarian way.
No, so I agree completely with John. I think the left is bankrupt. I think it's finished. It's fragmented. It's in many ways in America, it's in its dying throes. It's become wacky. It's become totally crazy.
The loony left. Remember the loony left? It
truly is a loony left. And look, last time they were loony, and less loony than now, was the 1960s. And there was a massive backlash against that. The 1972 election was basically a referendum on the loony left, and the loony left was crushed. I'm much more worried about the right. And maybe wrongly, but I'm much more worried about the response from the right because I don't see energy. Around the liberal right. I don't see energy around a defense of freedom on the right. And while, again, I'll believe John about DeSantis, I also see a lot of illiberal things that DeSantis is doing.
And name 3 of them.
What?
And name 3 of them.
3 of them? A bill that he signed to criminalize social media dumping politicians from their platform. I mean,
depends on the interpretation, but go ahead.
Basically, that's what it said. And again, if anything, social media should be encouraged to dump politicians from the platform more than anybody else. That was one. It was not allowing cruise ships to require vaccines, to have a vaccine requirement. In opposition to Washington's requiring them to have vaccines. So that's 2. And I think banning CRT from curriculum is illiberal. Now, I'm against CRT, and I think that should be done at the school board level, and they should ban it, but I don't think it should be done by the state at the state level. Those are 3. I could come up with a couple of others.
Okay. I don't think the foundations of the Republic are trembling.
No, not on these issues. But it's a tendency. Anyway, I'm worried about the right. I'm worried about the response to the wacky left. I'm not worried about the wacky left, and I'm worried about the fact that nobody on the right, and again, put aside politics, I'm talking about the intellectual world, who with, I think, significant influence, is talking about kind of the ideas of liberty and ideas of freedom from the right. They've adopted, whether they mean it or not, they've adopted the language of populism and to some extent authoritarianism from the right. And I don't think that America will ever be a leftist country. I don't think America will ever go, as I think Europe might, ever go for socialism and kind of the wacky left. It's too wacky, it's too insane, it's unpatriotic. Americans are patriotic fundamentally.
Okay, now I understand where we differ. Okay, now I get it. And it's a legitimate, honest disagreement. And believe me, I respect your opinion. Yaron believes that populism ultimately veers towards authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. I think the American experience teaches us that's a danger, but it's not essential that it happens that way. I urge you to read, even though you will disagree with parts of it, and even though I disagree with parts of it, Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Yeah. Not exactly a fount of Enlightenment thinking. No. And I'm not trying to dump on Arkansas, but not exactly a fount of Enlightenment thinking. Tom Cotton gave a speech 2 weeks ago at the Ronald Reagan Library on trying to merge Reaganism with populism. And just read it and let me know
Okay.
what you think of it.
Okay, I will, thank you.
Are libertarians anywhere or nowhere, in your opinion?
Sorry.
Where is it?
Ah,
Libertarians
that's a
anywhere or
very,
nowhere?
very good question. That's an excellent question. I would say,
What was the question?
no, but I had the distinction between anywheres and nowheres. Remember, people who are cosmopolitan, citizens of the world, people who are rooted in their community. I think there's a form of individualism that I, for one, haven't appreciated enough, which is the Jacksonian democracy in America, which basically is leave me alone, but if you bother me, I'll kill you attitude. And I think we have a more rarefied philosophical approach if you have a certain amount of education. I think the instinctive native individualism of America is rooted in the community and leave us alone. In other words, our public schools are our public schools and don't dictate, what we teach there from afar. But many libertarians of a certain education or income level do have a citizen of the world aspect. There used to be an element of libertarianism that was open borders. I worked for an editor once who said there should be open borders. Well, as Milton Friedman taught us, you can either have open borders or a welfare state, but you cannot have both. And you have to make compromises if you want both. You have to make adjustments, because if you have open borders with a complete welfare state, you're asking for trouble. And if you have a welfare state and closed borders, you're also asking for trouble. So that's an excellent question. I think that the one thing we need to avoid as libertarians is to avoid the pitfall that our cosmopolitan, internationalist, multilateral brethren committed or fell into, and that is to be snobs. I think we have to not condescend, look down upon, or belittle the average person who gets up in the morning to support their family, works hard, and believes that they're not respected and they're not treated as full citizens. And I think that even though we don't live that experience, we don't feel that experience, we have a different experience, I think we have to recognize that unless we get a lot of those people on our side, we're not going to accomplish anything.
So I think libertarians are both, right? And it's split.
That's right, I agree.
Some libertarians are cosmopolitan in a sense, not in the sense of necessarily global citizens, but are comfortable anywhere and are pro-trade and pro-immigration. And I think it's a false dichotomy to have open borders, closed borders, even welfare state. And I think the thing that we should really focus on is the evil of the welfare state. Because if we can agree that without a welfare state, the borders should be open, at least relatively open, then we've gone a long way, right? Then let's focus on fighting the welfare state. But then you find, and I'd say the von Mises Institute in the U.S. is a good example of libertarians who are not very international, if you will, or very parochial and very isolated and a very nationalist in a negative sense, right? They're anarchist and nationalist at the same time, which is quite a feat that I have not managed to.
Which is one of the reasons they're not growing.
Yeah, and they're not going anywhere, exactly. But at the end of the day, I think we need to recognize that there's importance to national borders, and it's important to have nations. One world government and institutions like the UN are not good for liberty. They're not good for freedom. And at the same time, be comfortable with global trade, global migration, and global travel. At the end of the day, we do want, the best thing about the European Union is open borders, open trade, open capital flows. That's the only good thing I'd say about the European Union. And if they stuck to that, if all they'd done was open migration, open capital, open, then the European Union would something to be celebrated if they'd gotten rid of the systematic regulation and controls out of Brussels. That's what we're striving towards. The path to which we get there, is going to be challenging because of the existence of a welfare state.
I think we have another question
And
somewhere.
we have one, 2, 3, 4 questions, last 4 questions, please.
And we'll keep our answers shorter.
Yeah.
As a anywhere cosmopolitan employee of a state school, I do go very much to battle against forms of wokeness as a progressive. Yeah?
Where do you teach?
I teach in a bilingual high school here in Vienna.
Oh, okay.
Nice.
Nice.
And I do all kinds of crazy things, like make my Muslim students read Salman Rushdie and stuff like that. So, I
Good for you.
go for the political correctness stuff. And I think, yeah, you're right to ridicule. I think it'll resolve itself, this craziness, yeah? But it is very authoritarian. I'll admit that. But I appreciate that you recognize that there's illiberalism from the right, and that it's also a danger. And I think the president of Russia and his oligarchical minions are an example of.
Do you think they're on the right?
Yeah.
How do you define right?
That there are oligarchs who want to destroy the European Union, have been supporting right-wing parties all over the place.
Okay. Here we have, look, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead and finish. I apologize.
Okay. And have more or less bought the UK because, there's billions and billions of their...
They only leased it. Now they're losing their lease.
Hopefully, if they find the offshore
Okay.
shells,
So you had
all that money.
but you had a question.
Good.
Okay.
Good. Just to Russell's choice, I don't understand the EU bashing that you guys have been doing, because yeah, it is open borders. So it is a bastion of what we would call classical liberalism in a way, and it's coming out that way. And it's
Have you ever met Guy Verhofstadt? Have you ever met him?
It's going to go on forever if you keep interrupting.
I'm sorry.
But we can do it forever. We'll continue
Okay,
it on.
go ahead.
And I think that is emerging with this invasion of the Ukraine, that the EU represents something with regard to that kind of freedom. And our former U.S. president his foreign minister spent 4 years attacking Merkel and supporting the AfD and every party that wants to blow Europe up into pieces, yeah, and wants to separate it. So this is a bastion of what we all, I think, are consider liberalism. But I don't understand why there's such an anti-European attitude on some parts of the right. Yeah?
Well, I'm glad you're here, and I would love to get your email to have a longer correspondence with you. I'll just put my cards on the table. I think for the people in this room, I think we have to push back on this notion of what the media and certain people who dominate the conversation consider right wing. I grew up at a place and a time where Ronald Reagan said, we are constantly told that we have to make a false choice between something called the right and something called the left. And Ronald Reagan said, the core and essence of my philosophy is that the political spectrum does not move in a horizontal direction from right to left. It moves in a vertical direction, up or down, up to the maximum degree of freedom consistent with order, or down to the ant heap of totalitarianism. That is the axis in the spectrum that we should be debating. I reject completely, and I'm a student of history on this matter, I've even written an academic paper on it. I reject that the Nazis were right-wing. I reject,
Socialists.
well, they're even advertised it. Read Adam Tooze's Economic History of the Third Reich. If you read that, you'll know what they are. And that's the economic history. Now let me finish. I reject that Putin has anything to do with the right wing. He is a thug. And because he's got a temporary alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church, doesn't negate the fact that everything he's doing is against every Christian value. I reject this right wing versus left wing. I reject that Guy Verhofstadt, who used to be, when I interviewed him, he was the Belgian Thatcher. I am old enough to have met the original Guy Verhofstadt, who would say about today's Guy Verhofstadt, you spineless little Brussels bureaucrat, what do you think you are calling this liberalism? This is bureaucratism. So I reject the premise of your entire argument and question. And we can, that's right. And that's why I want to have an extended email conversation with you. But I reject this right versus left completely. I'm a Reaganite, pure and simple. It's up or down. It's not right or left.
So, can I? So I agree. I mean, right or left have become meaningless. Maybe they had a meaning a long time
In the
ago.
Chamber of Deputies in the Paris. The
Yeah,
French Republic,
because
the French
that one was
Parliament.
on the right, one was on the left. It
Right.
doesn't mean anything. What I don't think up and down means much more. But I do think this idea of authoritarianism, or I would say the real spectrum, is collectivism versus individualism.
Yes.
And Putin is a collectivist. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people who identify with the right are collectivists, even though, again, right, left. And what happens is, the reason you view Putin as a right is because he's anti-woke, right? He agrees with us on the anti-woke stuff, so he's anti the wacky left. Because there are two forms of collectivism. There's a woke collectivism today, and there's a nationalist, other type of collectivism. And they are both bad. And what we represent, or should represent, and need to fight for, is the individualism of liberty, the individualism of freedom, and that's what. And let me just say quickly on the EU. You know, I don't bash the original intent of the EU. What I bash is the bureaucratic, authoritarian, regulatory superstate that has been created in Brussels. The fundamental, essential characteristic of the EU as free trade, free movement of capital, people, and goods is a beautiful vision, and I completely endorse it. Get rid of the regulations.
Common legal framework between the countries?
What do you need a common legal framework? Let there be competition. Let there be competition for legal status.
But isn't the fight for freedom and for individualism, we also have to fight for the property rights? Because if you don't own anything anymore, you can't have freedom and you can't have individualism. So that's because you talked about the person that gets up in the morning, goes to work, earns a living, takes care of his family, and it makes no difference if he earns a lot or not. He cares for his family and he earns a living, and maybe he bought some property, and he has also some interest in securing his property rights. And what I'm really scared of is people in Europe that think, okay, the oligarchs, they stole everything, now we have the sanctions are kind of expropriation already, and now the next are the richest of the country, and at the end it's also the middle class, but Europeans are too stupid to get that point, that not in the long run, but in the short run, they are the ones that will be expropriated by their state. And coming to the state is not an anonymous mass, it's also a person that works for the state. It's maybe my neighbor that has the right to expropriate my fortune, but it's also an individual person that is paid by my taxes. So I think we have to talk to people and explain to them where the danger really is, and we have to fight for freedom, individualism, property.
And that's exactly what Yaron was talking about. This is a philosophical principle that is worth fighting for and explaining. One of the things I haven't figured out or wrapped my arms around is the oligarchs in Russia today are basically state apparatchiks. Almost all of their income is derived from the state. So that, in one sense, in sanctioning it, you're sanctioning illegitimate wealth.
Yeah.
On the other hand, many of the sanctions do have an effect on average people. Cutting off credit cards, cutting off SWIFT payments and things like that makes it much more difficult for average middle-class people to survive in Russia. They're just trying to get on with their lives. I mean, they may draw a salary, but you know, you can. It's very hard to make a clean break between wealth that has been stolen or is illegitimate and what people's property is in an authoritarian dictatorship.
But who decides if it's...
I agree. That's why it's a difficult problem. And that's why we're gonna have, the longer this Ukraine thing goes on, the more ethical dilemmas we're gonna have on that basis.
But just a different perspective on that. Look, innocents get killed in wars. They're innocent victims for wars. And who's to blame? The party to blame is the party that initiates force. Every innocent in Russia suffering from the sanctions is Putin's fault. It's not the fault of people putting the sanctions on. It's Putin's fault. And we should focus on blaming the person who initiated force here, who created the circumstances, and that is Putin. And it's so they're always innocent victims of authoritarianism. And these are just more of them.
Okay, Yaron, your agenda is it needs more philosophy than economics. Am I right?
Yes.
And you blamed or said that Hayek was a good economist.
Great economist, not just a good economist, a great economist.
Point.
Yes.
My question is the following.
Yeah.
I think Hayek made a very good point in a philosophical issue, the distinction between the small group and the huge society, the
Yes.
state.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the small group can work with solidarity, sympathy, and so on. And the bigger society, the state, needs rules. And now my point is, and you said it more or less, that nowadays in Europe, I only know Europe, maybe it's in the United States, the same situation, the rule of law is not as sacrosanct as it was before.
Yes. Yes.
So it's a kind of utilitarianism,
Yes.
especially in Germany.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very, very dangerous development. And the point is, and we can, I think this is not a very highly sophisticated issue, but this point you can tell nearly everybody on the street.
But
what's the danger if you put away the rule of law?
But this is the issue with the rule of law, and this is my problem with Hayek. Hayek doesn't ground the rule of law in anything. Hayek does not accept the Lockean concept of individual rights as the basic foundation of the rule of law. And once you don't do that, then you get a lot of bad laws that, we should question and seriously question. And you don't have a framework, you don't have a principle by which to guide the laws. This is the big difference between, I think, the United States and Europe. That Europe never embraced the concept of individual rights and built the legal system around it. America tried. It didn't survive. It has survived to this day, but there was at least an attempt. You need the concept of individual rights, and it has nothing to do with small or big. Individual rights rule, in a sense, whether it's politically, whether it's in a small group or a big group. The purpose is to protect those rights and to leave people free as long as they're not, violating those rights of other people. So, I think this is a flaw in European liberalism, is that they've abandoned the great Scottish Enlightenment, particularly here in the continent. You guys did not embrace the Scottish Enlightenment, and you still, and I think in modern America we haven't embraced it either, but the roots are in the concept of individual rights, and Hayek, unfortunately, makes a mistake there.
One thing I wanted to mention earlier is, I think every one of us has now an opportunity to play, the game you should never play is I told you so, because no one wants to hear that. So never play the game I told you so. What you should say is, never again.
Yeah.
I think one of the most consequential mistakes in Europe in the last quarter century was when Germany decided to prematurely shut down all of its nuclear power plants and move towards solar, wind, and other unicorn forms of energy, where now you have 55% of Germany's winter energy needs supplied by something named Vladimir Putin. And Austria is not far behind. Pardon?
Only 14.
Only 40.
14.
Only 40%.
14. Only 40. Jeez.
Austria had one nuclear power plant, I guess, and it never opened. I guess Kreisky had something to do with that. So now you get all your nuclear power from the Czech Republic at extremely expensive prices. I think that for all of these newfound opponents of dictatorship, who now have decided that maybe it was a mistake to give Vladimir Putin all of this free hand, I think energy is something that everyone uses, and I think you can make a practical and a philosophical argument about dependency, that one of the great mistakes that the European Union and its allied departments and the German government and the Austrian government committed was basically making you completely dependent on Putin. This is by all objective standards a mistake, which is why in part you're restrained in having to find a way to strike back at Russia over the Ukraine issue. We have to have more diverse forms of energy in Europe. We have to. Even the Greens in the German coalition government are going to have to swallow the perpetuation of some nuclear power plants. I think this is a great argument to make. This is a great debate. The other side will run from it. Don't let them. Pursue them. Hunt them down. And force them to admit their mistake. I mean, I had dinner with a family last night here in Vienna. They showed me their energy bill. My eyes popped out of my head. I couldn't believe it. These are pre-revolutionary times. And we're only starting the increase in energy prices. This is a political opportunity. This is a philosophical opportunity. So go seize it. I mean,
I think in
this
many
is a
ways,
winner.
I think in many ways the war in Ukraine might turn out to be
A wake-up call.
a wake-up call, but in some senses a positive. I think it is. You're seeing it on the American right to the extent that there is such a thing. That those who are pro-Putin, there are a few of them, right? There's the Sohab Amaris of the world who are pro-Putin. They're being discredited, and there's the whole trend towards that nationalism. I think the authoritarianism, the collectivism that tempted some people on the right in America. Maybe this will be the wake-up call. That maybe this will discredit them. So there could be some positive outcomes out of this. Nuclear energy should be number one. They never should have shut them down, Putin or no Putin. Even without Putin, there's no reason to shut down nuclear power plants. It's the cheapest, it's the cleanest form of energy you can have. It's insanity.
Last question, and then gentlemen,
Yep.
you just
Yes, Yaron.
give your
Yep.
famous last words for today.
Yes, Yaron.
Yeah.
You, on one hand, way at the beginning said that people are motivated by being on the right side morally, and on the other hand, you studied Ayn Rand, who also deals with morality. Do you care to comment on the moral base of the correct side of liberalism?
Well, I mean, that will take me more time than we have, but I will just say that the battle is over individualism. And what we need is a moral foundation for individualism. It's the individual's moral right, not just political right, to pursue his own happiness. And again, I think it's in the Enlightenment. It's hinted at the Enlightenment. It's developed in the Enlightenment. It's in the Declaration of Independence. I think the greatest political document in all of human history. The idea that we have inalienable rights. The idea that one of those rights is a right, or the rights are to your life, not to some communal anything, but to your life. And part of that life is a community, but the focus is your life, it's your liberty. And in the most individualistic statement ever, right, the right to pursue happiness. So that's the energy that, if we had a movement about the pursuit of happiness, a rational idea of the pursuit of happiness, not the left's, nihilistic and hedonistic view, but a rational idea of the pursuit of happiness, the rational idea of a political system geared towards protecting your right to pursue happiness, that is the kind of energy and excitement and passion that I think we need to bring to the debate, the rejection of collectivism in all its forms, and stand on the banner of individualism. That's how we win, and that's how you get young people. We need to be idealists. I mean, one of the things that young people want is ideals to strive towards. And the left has won through idealism, and I think one of the reasons the left is imploding is the ideals are so wacky now that young people are going to reject them ultimately. I think we need idealism, and I think that the Declaration of Independence provides us with idealism, and we need to embrace that and celebrate that and run with it. And we've been too timid because I think we worry about the implications of it.
Before Barbara sends us off, I just want to say, I think this is the third time that I've spoken at a Hayek Saal. And I just want to say, one of the reasons that I really appreciate the audiences here is, first of all, I realize that being in a relatively small country, it's not surprising that you should have a broad range of knowledge about the rest of the world, including the United States, but you do. But you also are very keenly inquisitive. You ask very good questions. And I have to say, I address a lot of audiences, and I suspect Yaron does too. And this is one of the very best, and you really, really do yourself proud. You may be small in number, but you keep us on our toes. Thank you.
Yeah.
In that case, thank you, gentlemen. This was wonderful.